Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Sean Redmond from the School of Law in the University of Limerick, and I'd like to welcome you all here this afternoon. Apologies to colleagues who are here for the workshop session this morning. In my introduction, I'm going to probably cover a little bit of the same ground, but I'm conscious that we have some new people joining us and also over the web as well. So a huge kind of welcome to everybody. It's a really exciting seminar today. This seminar came about as a consequence of conversations that started, initiated, I should say, by colleagues from the maths department, where we were invited over a long time ago to come and talk about some new research that we'd done, which is now called the Greentown study, a small case study. But it was an overt gesture from the maths department to come and listen to, or to listen to some of the work that we'd done, which was essentially a qualitative case design. We know that crime networks are kind of really complex social phenomenon. What we also know is that they are a really awful phenomenon for people who live in local communities, and particularly from my situation as a civil servant in the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, the effect that that has on children's criminal behaviour and also their exploitation as well. The problem itself has been tended to looked at in two ways with the scientific community. One has been through quantitative inquiry, which has really helped us to have incisive analysis and examinations of the size and shape of networks, centrality, betweenness, and some better sense really of how power flows through networks as well. We also have a tradition which is more ethnographic and qualitative design, which gives us a real kind of picture of what life must be like within these networks for the people we're interested in, children. Individually, these both these approaches have distinctive contributions to make, but we guess that together we can develop a much more powerful and a much more precise examination of how these networks operate, what makes them tick, and where their vulnerabilities may be as well. So what we hope to get from this seminar today is a sense of what distinctive contributions both of these approaches make, but also by the end is the potential kind of collaborations between the two disciplines and also the benefits of taking both approaches. So without further ado, I just want to say a little bit about both speakers. Dr. Bruno Cunha, who I had the pleasure of meeting about 8 or 9 months ago, who was a visiting senior police officer within the Federal Police in Brazil, who's done a huge amount of work on quantitative analysis of police networks, and also Dr. Catherine Norton, who is leading a lot of the work that we're actually doing within the REP project in relation to crime networks in Ireland as well. So I'd like to perhaps invite Catherine up to make the first presentation. Thank you.
So I'm delighted to be here to represent the REP team. So the work Sean, as those of you who were here this morning will know, has designed this project and is the PI on this project. And my colleague Owen, who's sitting there, worked predominantly on the Greentown project. So as Sean said, I am going to be covering a little bit of repetitive stuff because of the new people that are here and because of the live stream. But over the next half hour, I'm going to tell you a little bit about an overview of youth crime in Ireland, just to give you some context. Then I will talk in detail about the Greentown study findings, and then we'll go on to move on to the two replication case studies, which were Redtown and Bluetown. And finally, I'll give you an overview of where all that research is leading to design a programme intervention specifically for children who have caught up in crime networks. So this graph some of you would have seen before, and this was compiled by Barry over there, who's a senior analyst in the Garda analyst services. And what he did was he took a cohort of young people who were all born in 1990. And then looked at the pulse crime data for that cohort. So specifically, when they were 12 years of age, or in their 12th year, there was less than 500 crimes detected or recorded on the pulse data for that cohort. By the time they reached 18, that was closer to 6,000. And then after that, it started to drop. Now, this is nothing new, or the research would show that this is common in most Western jurisdictions, that actually children tend to grow out of crime. But when we look at this from a different perspective, so we convert that 6,000 crimes at 18 years of age into number of children or young people. So we see that the vast majority of them are not committing crime, 90%. And of that 10% that do commit a crime, the majority of them commit less than 3 offences. And those offences tend to be those typical crimes associated with young people, alcohol-related public order offences. But when you go and look at the top end, so the children or young people who are committing 4 or more crimes, those crimes look quite differently. As Sean said this morning, for those of you who were here, they tended to be crimes like burglary and drugs for sale or supply, so more serious crimes. So the majority of the literature in this area tends to focus on that minority, or the majority of young people who commit more typical crimes. But Greentown was focused on that minority of kids. And when we put that into real terms, you see that actually less than 5% of children are responsible for over 50% of the crime. So they really are important to understand where they're coming from. So the Greentown project came about to identify those factors which impact on prolific and more serious offending. And the first hint to this was the crimes. So burglary and drugs for sale or supply, they were more likely to involve adult involvement. So who supplied them with the drugs? Who was helping them to dispose of the stolen goods? So Sean came up with this innovative design called Twin Sight, where he wanted to tap into the local on-the-ground police expertise and give us a better picture of what was going on for those children. And to do this, he worked in partnership with the Garda Analyst Services to come up with a map which showed those co-offending relationships. And the Greentown finding then, what it found was actually there was a criminal network in operation. Up to that, we just had a network map which kind of suggested there was, but there was a thing. And what the qualitative data or interview data showed us was that there was actually really complex relationships between adults and children. But what we also found was that network was hierarchical. At its core, or what you maths people would call a rich club, was a group, or family, a dominant core family. And the structure of the network in itself, there was a culture of fear and compliance both within the network, but that also extended into the community, the wider community. And that fear actually, my slides are moving on now themselves, so we'll go. But that helped sustain the network. So what we saw was that the network in itself had this impact on the children, and it was seen to encourage, or not only did it encourage, but it compelled certain vulnerable children in the community into that atypical pattern of criminal behaviour. So this is the map here that Sean showed you earlier. And as he said, when you look at that map, the leader is in that map. And for the people that are coming new to this, the green lines, every circle is a node which represents an individual. The green lines refer to co-offending burglary offences. The blue lines refer to other offences that weren't specified. And the red lines were related to drug for sale and supply. So what we saw was, well, if we go back to that map, when you look at that, the most central person on that map is D1. He's right in the middle. He seems to have all those connections. And when I often give this presentation and I ask people, okay, who do you think the leader is? And immediately they all say D1. And fair enough, but what you have to remember here is that this map is based on detections. So actually, D1 was very good or bad, depending on what perspective you're looking at, for getting caught. So he wasn't being protected by the network. So what we saw was actually A2 down here at the bottom was the leader. And what was really interesting about the qualitative research was that we saw that actually his family were very involved in the network. So his younger brother, who was only 15, is down there B2. And then his son, who was only 12 years of age, was also active in the network. So we found that there was two very different groups of young people. So you can see that A2 is linked to D1, who we spoke about earlier, and E1 and A1 through other related offences. And what we found was that those three individuals, they're young adults there now, 18 to 20 years of age, but they grew up within the network. They were vulnerable children who were brought into the recruited into the network, and then they kind of had a succession, but they weren't protected like the family children were, because you can see that actually they're being detected for quite a lot of crimes. Their role was somewhat middle management. They were responsible for debt collection and doing jobs like that. But importantly for this research, and really a little bit more cynical, they had a huge role in recruiting. So they actively selected, targeted and recruited vulnerable young children into the network, where they groomed the young children. And I'll talk a little bit about that again in a minute. But they groomed the children for crime. So this shows you a quick look at the two different types of children in the network. So I spoke about the family children who had an automatic membership of the network. That was their role in life. They were going in there. And they also had a succession-like journey through the network, in that they were being prepared for leadership roles. But the associate children were very different. So they were actively recruited into the network based on vulnerabilities. So these children were all coming from very chaotic backgrounds. They had a lot of adversities in their lives. They tended to be early school leavers. So they were with peer groups who were similar, who had adversity and were early school leavers, and they were hanging around. But there was some degree of agency. They were attracted into the network. Remember, these young people were excluded from school and from society in general. So they were attracted by physical gains, so access to money. It was a career. They were actually something they were good at. They had success, and they got kudos within the network for that success. They were also interested in getting access to drugs and alcohol, but there was also very strong psychosocial pulls. So suddenly they had an identity. They were part of something. They were associated with the leaders, and that gave them power and status within the network. So they were very strong attractions to the network. But once they were in the network, things changed, because they lacked that agency then. Because if they didn't want to do something that was ordered from the higher status people in the thing, the fear of not committing an offence, or of committing an offence, the fear of not committing an offence and the punishment from the network members itself was much stronger than the fear of being detected for that offence by an Garda Síochána. So it was really difficult for them to get out. So they were very hard, what we call in criminology terms, to knife off or to leave the network. So I'm going to bring you back to the Greentown network again, just to show you some of that. So the inside circle was the original map I showed you. And I just want you to look at those three associates there up in the top with the black dotted lines around them, and see how they are linked in through other offences to groups of children up there on the left-hand corner. So that shows how they are targeting those children and bringing them in. But also, if you look down at the two children from the family, so a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old, and see how they're linked into the children. So the children are under 18s are denoted by light pink and light blue. So that gave us huge insights into what was going on, and it kind of rendered these children before more visible, because we didn't look at their contexts like this. So, and it also showed us that individual level of focus that we have with children doing more typical crimes did not apply to these children, because the network had a huge influence on them, so it was a better unit of analysis. We also have a really good and effective deferral system in Ireland. You know, the diversion system is really good, but unfortunately, it works for those atypical crimes. But when the children were pulled into this network and where there was coercion, they were also taught and mentored in how to game the diversion system. So it lost its effectiveness. I also spoke about how the formal criminal justice system really works in those atypical crimes. People are afraid of the guards. They're afraid of having a charge. Whereas in the network situation, they were more afraid of that local governance and the network governance. So really, we often look at crime as being a moral choice. But here in this situation, in Greentown situation, that choice was severely mitigated by the coercive control that they were experiencing. So that was one case study. It was really interesting information, but it was one location in Ireland. So we needed to see, okay, does that resonate throughout the rest of Ireland? So what we did was a national prevalence study. And what we did a survey with juvenile liaison officers. Now they are members of a Garda Síochána. They're experienced and they're trained to work specifically with young people who are in contact with the law. And we had a great response rate. So the survey was grounded in the Greentown survey, and we wanted to see if they had children that presented similar to the Greentown study in their locations. Well, 90% responded to the JLO to the survey from all over Ireland. 86% of them said that they were aware of a child who presented with such complex needs, and that equated to about 1/8 of their caseload, which when you put it into real terms, it's approximately 1,000 children or young people. So I'm not going to go into any more detail, but as with the Greentown study, if you want to get the report, you're more than welcome to download it from that link. So that was really good because it told us more about how big the problem was. But what was really interesting, when the JLOs talked about the young people, they weren't just confined to large urban areas. This was also happening with children in rural areas. So it was really important for us to see, okay, we understand what's happening in Greentown, and are those dynamics and that structure that's going on in Greentown, does that relate into other locations? So we did 2 more replication studies, and we used the same methodology that Sean used in the Greentown study, where the Garda Analyst Service ranked all the Garda districts in Ireland in terms of young people who committed burglary or drugs for sale and supply. And to show how this is 4 years on. So to show how sustainable the network in Greentown was, it went from being ranked 11th in 2010 up to being ranked 2nd. And there was also 2 other areas, Bluetown, which is in Dublin, and we did want to look at a major city or a part of Dublin, and Redtown, which is a provincial town. So this is a bit complicated, so don't worry about it. I'm going to go through each thing in detail. So really what I did was to look at the teams, look at what was the same or what was different between the 3 different networks. So the first one there was the number of networks. That might seem a little bit, okay, there's 1 network, but actually, you know, there was a different number of networks in each of the areas. So in Greentown, I've shown you how there was 1 network. In Bluetown was a sub-district of Dublin. There was 4 geographical areas, A, B, C, D there. And within those 4 geographical areas, there was 4 different networks who were organised differently. And then in Redtown, which was a small area, so people all lived quite close to one another. But the network was organised very differently depending on on the crime you looked at. So when you looked at burglary crime, it was organised in one way, and when you looked at drugs, the organisation was different. But these were very overlapping networks. In Bluetown, they were all very separate networks with separate people. In Redtown, it was the same people, but organised differently. So one of the main themes that came out of Greentown and the studies was proximity. So the members were all living close, that were co-offending together, were living close together, or else they had very strong ties to that area. And we saw that throughout all of the networks. So family then was a major theme. So I've spoken about Greentown and the central core family in Greentown, but also in Bluetown. So I talked about there being 4 different networks. In network 1, Bluetown had a really strong family at its centre. But that was quite different from Greentown in that it was confined to family members. So it was, and they didn't recruit from the outside. But what was really interesting as well about that network 1 in Bluetown, that B29, who was in network D, and B36, you can see their links straight away into the family 1 network. Well, they were actually family members who were living in different areas. So with that proximity in mind, they were, as they were younger, they were co-offending with the main groups, with the other local children. But once they grew up and were reaching the age of 18, they were gravitating back to Network A, and they were offending with members in Network A, or in Area A, Network 1. So when we looked at Redtown, so if you look at the top map, that's the family map, or that's relating to the burglary offences. And actually the narrative, so this is a small town, so the Garda narrative was all around 3 16-year-old boys who had committed a series of burglary offences with their older siblings and their peer group. So those 3 boys were all part of families. So if you can see there, one is in red, one is in green, and one is in blue. They're all families, and their families were all involved in crime. So family was really important here, but it wasn't like Greentown or Bluetown in that these were low status family. They weren't associated with power or control. They were chaotic. There was a huge amount of adversity in their families. So the next map down then looks at the drug network. So that contained the same individuals that were in the family network. But what was interesting here was the majority of the young people were all in that, what we call level 1. So as Sean said this morning, drugs, even though it didn't come up on the original map, one of the respondents said to me, every green line, which was burglary, should be a red line as well. But they weren't detected for drugs and for sale thing. But they had completely normalised drug use. And as one person said, they don't see themselves as in the drug business. They see themselves as supplying each other. But because they had experienced extreme adversity, they were more likely to develop drug-related problems or addictions. So then they were becoming debt obliged, and that was keeping them within the network, and it made them very easily exploited. But family was also important here, but in a different sense. So those leaders in terms of the drugs for sale or supply were undetected. So they weren't on the original map. So they were on the outside there, and they tended to be older family members. And just like the young people in Bluetown gravitated back to the network, you had young people who were committing burglary with the group, but as they reached 18 years of age, they were gravitating towards their older brothers and fathers and getting involved, as one guard said, in the drug business with them. So when we looked at the strength and stability, so when family was at the centre, there was really strong trust bonds between the family groups. Now this is high status families like in Greentown and Bluetown Network 1. But also the level of organisation. So if there was strong bonds, there was also a strong level of organisation. But when you looked at the drugs network in Redtown, but also the drug network in Bluetown, which was Bluetown 4, Network 4, there was quite a lot of drugs activity there. You saw that there was actually an outside influence. So they were linked to organised crime. But because they weren't on the network, it was hard to get more details about that. But that brought in that coercive control and that element of fear. And that fear prevented the young people from talking about what was going on. And so it made detection really difficult, and it made, disrupting the network difficult as well. So this is what I was talking about a little bit here. I jumped ahead of myself. So when there were strong family bonds and there was organised fear-based, as in Greentown network, Bluetown network 1 and 4, and the Redtown drugs network, it inhibited reporting. And don't forget that some of this now extended out into the community. And that led to the protection of the leaders. Now, as I said earlier when I was talking about the Greentown network and those associated young people, they weren't protected like the family people were protected. But the leaders were being protected, and it made it very difficult to detect and difficult to disrupt. Whereas in the drugs or in the burglary network, which we saw with Redtown, and in the networks 2 and 3 in Bluetown, they were really chaotic, very badly organised. There were low status family, there was limited restrictions to reporting, limited protection. For instance, when I talked about the 3 young people in Redtown, like one of those 16-year-olds was leading the way. At 16 years of age, he was able to source cars on Dundee, buy them for €100. He knew where to go to commit crimes, and he knew to drive out of town to dispose of the goods. And that young person actually took a more leadership role in the drugs network as well. But when he was detected and sent to prison, the crime rate in that area dropped by 50%. So that showed how important it was to disrupt that network. So there was also evidence, we talked earlier about that young people grow out of crime. So in Area D, we showed you that at the start, where there was actually no active network at present, but some of those had been arrested and others just grew out of crime when that malign influence was removed. But in Redtown, we also saw some young people who had a very, very proactive maternal support. And they managed to move out of crime and into more pro-social activity. And in Greentown, we saw some individuals who were less embedded, but on the outskirts, that were able to move out of crime. So child recruitment, I've kind of covered this already, was really important. So the family children were it was an automatic entry into the network. And then the vulnerable local children all came from really chaotic backgrounds, and there was a degree of coercive control and drug debt obligation. So just to come back to the children again, because the children are what we were really interested in. We saw that all the children, now the family children tended to be protected from physical neglect because there was a degree of wealth there. So they had food and basic needs like that. But all of the children came from emotionally or economically deprived areas, and they came with multiple adversities. I don't know if you're familiar with the word ACEs, but they ticked all the boxes. So they had parental loss, they had incarceration of family members, there was physical and emotional abuse and neglect, there was parental substance abuse, and there was mental health issues, and also a huge degree of family violence and abuse. There was also poor guardianship and supervision. And now that is not to start blaming the parents, because these parents were dealing with their own adversities as well. There was school exclusion right across the board, and they weren't involved. They weren't going to be the young people that were in the local GAA club or the soccer club. They weren't involved in pro-social activities or community membership. And they all then gravitated to people like themselves, young people like themselves, problematic peer groups. What was really important was that not alone had these young people got those adversities, but it was coupled with really strong family norms that were pro-crime norms. So, and they grew up in that, and then they entered the problematic peer groups, and that reinforced it, and they made them really vulnerable for recruitment into networks and for exploitation by people with sale and supply of drugs. So really what you can see is that young person is in his ecosystem. Now, this is the psychology part of me coming out, that we all live in an ecosystem. So that young person, you know, was getting their needs met by this ecosystem, but they had very limited choices. That's down to the fear and coercive control. And their families were compromised, not only by adversity, but also they could have debt issues with the local network. So their ability to act was compromised. They were also in those peer groups that had similar views in life. And then, as I said earlier, that fear and intimidation sometimes extended out into the community, and therefore their community was compromised as well. But even though this ecosystem sounds terrible, it was their ecosystem. It did supply them with their needs, like physical needs, like access to money, something to do, occupation, but also that sense of belonging, identity, status, safety, a degree of safety, because they felt safer in the network than outside the network. And it gave them purpose and meaning. They had no problem getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go robbing. And they were good at it. So they got, you know, positive feedback because of that. So when we take a child out of that ecosystem, you do need to replace the ecosystem with a pro-social ecosystem. And that leads us on to our intervention. So I'm running short on time, so I'm going to go just give you an overview of this. And of course, we will be coming back to this again and again. So really, when you're looking at an intervention for this group of children, normally you take a program, an evidence-based program, generally from the States or the UK, and then you drop it into an area. But that leads to all sorts of problems because it needs to be specific to the context. So there was no suitable off-the-peg programs. So 2 years ago, Sean led a program where we looked. It was a deliberative process to identify and establish an intervention that would specifically meet the needs of these children caught up in crime networks. And it was about building bridges between academia on one side and policy makers on the other side. So we integrated both evidence-based knowledge, but also that real-world application. And the core objectives were to disrupt network influence and also to improve the lives of children caught up in criminal networks. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what the model looks like. So it's kind of like an orchestra. So there are 4 different sections to the orchestra. They can all play on their own, but actually they make much nicer sound when they're all together. Well, I suppose that's debatable, but anyway, in the centre is the conductor. So it's a multidisciplinary governance model, which is quite simple and organise the rest. So that model works on the ecosystem that I told you about. So first of all, the important thing would be network disruption. How do we best disrupt the network to allow the children to come out of the network? But when those children come out, we need to have support systems in place. One, I talked about the families having severe adversities, and so it's really important to support the child and the family. So in that case, that's child self-determination. There will be an intensive support model place for the children and their families. Also, if the children are coming out, a big problem for these children was they didn't have any pro-social activities. So it's about giving them those opportunities, having education placements for them, having voluntary placements or apprenticeships for them. And then one thing that's really important, so we talked about the fear in the community, is the community efficacy. This needs to be a community-based model where the community themselves can start to believe that they can tackle this crime, that they can report crime, and that they are supported by the local Garda in doing that. Okay, so that's me. Thank you very much. I'm sure we keep questions for later on.
Thank you all for coming, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the maths of criminal networks after this great presentation by Catherine. I don't need to motivate you, but I will try it anyway. So crime is a complex phenomenon that depends non-linearly on different variables, as do every human-related phenomenon, right? And however, there are a lot of mathematical regularities in the social world, and in collective human behavior, actions are robust with observation, as said Nicholas Kaldor. The idea here is that despite the free will and that humans take action, there are several regularities in every social-related phenomenon that can be tackled by mathematics. And besides that, there are a lot of sociological literature that supports the use of network science and mathematical tools to understand social-related and crime-related phenomena. Besides that, there is something that is very interesting to talk about, which is something called sociophysics that some of you may have heard about. Actually, the idea of applying physics concepts and natural science concepts to social phenomena is not new. It started in the 1700s with the famous philosopher David Hume, who proposed that the methods used in natural science should be used to understand the human being, at least the collective behavior of human beings. After him, we had Adolphe Quetelet, who actually started what is called the positive school of criminology, which is basically the application of stats to criminal phenomena. And we had also the very famous one, Auguste Comte, which was the father of modern sociology, right? And he also believed that some of the methods of natural science should be applied to human behavior. And in modern days, there are a lot of examples of applications of natural science to social phenomena, which are very useful to understanding those concepts. For instance, cellular automata can map social aggregation. Magnetism can be applied to understand how opinions spread in modern societies. Epidemics and spreading phenomena of diseases, for instance, they can be kind of easily studied by mathematical tools. Chaos is an example of emergent behavior, which I was talking during the lunch with some of you guys. Criminal spots can be mapped by attraction fields similar to gravitation. Game theory and social dilemma, and what is of most interest for us here, criminal networks can be mapped by graph theory or network science. So I'm a little bit afraid to go into this because I know there are a lot of psychologists here, but anyway, this will serve as another motivation for you guys. This social facilitation model was proposed by Robert Junk in the 70s, and it actually it just says that behavior, beliefs, attitudes, and values of each individual are shaped by their social contexts. So this is also called the audience effect, right? So if I have this task, which is I have an habit on doing it, and I start performing the same task in front of an audience, that there's a tendency that I will perform better because of the presence of the others. On the other way around, if I should perform a task that I have no habit on doing it, and I'm placed in front of an audience, I'll probably perform not that good. And this is called social inhibition and social facilitation. But this is just to illustrate to you guys that the network in which people are embedded tends to facilitate criminal behavior, right? So we were just talking previously with Catherine that if you tend to display a given criminal behavior and you're put in a criminal medium, you're probably perform better in your criminal activities. So that is why it's very important to break down these connections and to disrupt the criminal relations. So I'm giving you again a few examples of criminal networks. The Twin Towers attack. Here we have each point is a terrorist, and they're related one to each other depending on the kind of participation that they had in the attack. Here we have the Operation Red Dawn, which caught the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. We have again all the connections here displayed by the edges, and the individuals related somehow to the dictator are represented by these figures here, and he's obviously the Ace of Spades. This is the network for Operation Car Wash. Some of you may have heard about it. It was actually the largest corruption network ever, if I'm not mistaken. It also, for instance, it resulted in the arrest of a former Brazilian president and several secretaries. So again, we have this huge network with a lot of criminals involved. But why is it important? Besides the obvious reasons, but why is it important to understand criminal networks from the graph theory point of view, from the network science point of view? Firstly, because if the architecture of these relations are random, it should be very easy to disrupt the system, right? This is called percolation theory. And if we just remove randomly individuals from a random network, after the removal of a small fraction of individuals, that system will tend to break down. On the other hand, if we have a different design, a different architecture, which is sometimes called heavy tail degree distribution, and we start removing randomly individuals from that criminal network, the network won't fall apart, at least not easily. It will have, you would have to remove almost all individuals from the network to actually dismantle it. But on the other way, if you use specifically target if you specifically target a few individuals which have a more relevant role in the architecture of the system, you can again disrupt the whole system by removing only a few individuals. And in this case here, we can see that after the removal of less than 25% of individuals, we can break down the network from its original size to literally nothing after this removal, right? So, that being said, what does it mean to be important? What does it mean to be relevant in the network architecture? Or as mathematicians like to say, in the network topology. So, I would like to ask you here, which one is more important, blue or red? Who's for blue? Who's for red? Who's for none of them? That's not an option. Okay, let's just try to visualize this network in a different way. This is the same network, the same relations, it's just viewed in a different fashion. So here we can see that if we remove blue, we just separate one individual from the network. While if we remove the red one, the network just breaks into 3 small pieces. Okay? So even though blue is the one that is mostly connected in the terms of the network topology, of the network architecture, is actually not the most important one. And now that you are able to understand here who was important in this small network, I would like you all to tell me who is more important here. Pretty easy, right? And in this one, it's obviously this guy, isn't it? So, if any of you guys work in law enforcement, you have obviously tackled operations with like 5, 10, 20 individuals being investigated. But if you actually try to tackle the problem as a whole, criminality problem as a whole, a big network, you probably will have to use mathematical tools to pinpoint the individuals that might be more important in the network topology. So again, what does it mean to be more important? Here we have 6 different views of the same network, and the colors here represent different centrality measures. And what we can see easily is that figures don't match, right? Colors are different, using different centrality measures. So let's try to understand some of these measures and try to get closer to the minimum dismantling set, right? So the first metric that I want to talk to you about is the degree, which is basically the amount of individuals that a given suspect is connected to, right? The second one is between centrality, which is basically the amount of paths between all individuals in the network that pass through the individual that is being targeted. So this is closely related to how fast information spreads into the network. So there are a lot of paths here, and how many of them passes through this guy. And the last one is the collective influence, which is basically the idea that not only the degree of the targeted individual is important, but also the degree of the neighborhood of that individual, right? In mathematical terms, the ball of a given radius that we choose to analyze. So we can have individuals that are not highly connected, but that are connected to other individuals that are highly connected. And actually this one, the collective influence, is proven analytically that is very close to the optimum dismantling set. There should be there are some properties that should be we should be a little bit concerned. For instance, in the network there shouldn't be a lot of cycles, so the network shouldn't be dense. If it is too much dense, we should use other methods that, if you want, we can talk about later. But that being said, I'm going to talk to you about some properties of real networks. So real networks tend to show this behavior called modularity. And this was actually proposed by Mark Granovetter in the 70s. He was a sociologist, an American sociologist. And the idea is that humans tend to cluster into highly densely connected clusters that are sparsely connected to other clusters, right? And these clusters are usually called modules or communities. And what Granovetter proposed is that weak ties can actually be more important than strong ties in keeping networks operating as a whole. In the conceptual point of view, weak ties are the ones that we don't have to spend a lot of social energy to maintain, like acquaintances. And strong ties are the ones that we have to spend a lot of social energy, if you will, to keep them running, like family, friends, business associates, etc. And we have proposed recently a network attack strategy which only removes the bridges among these communities, right? So we're not aiming at the most connected guy, not the one that has the highest between us, and not the one with the highest collective influence, but the one that is actually bridging densely connected clusters. And what we can show here is that we have this original network here, and we are removing 1%, 2%, and 3% of the nodes according to centrality-based attacks and according to module-based attacks, which is the one that I'm talking about. And here we can see that after 3% of removals, the network is totally fragmented after the use of the module-based attacks. I'm going to talk about some concepts now before I go to some real cases of application of these ideas. The first one is edge removal and node removal. We can attack a network, dismantle it by removing edges or nodes. An interpretation of that in the criminal point of view is that when we remove edges, we are arresting someone. When we arrest someone, at least some of the edges that he was connected to should be removed. But the node itself should be still active in the network. And node removal, when you think of it, you are either thinking of death, that individual ceases to exist, or total resocialization, in which the individual stops wanting to be part of a criminal network. And these definitions have very important applications when you are thinking of the maths behind it. It's totally different modeling mathematically edge removal and node removal. Besides that, it's important to understand what is network brightness. So the idea here is that the density of nodes is related to how clandestine a given network is. If a network is very dense, the idea is that if one individual is captured by police, he would have a lot of information about the local structure of the network, and he will be able to tell the police some sensitive data about the operation of the criminal enterprise that he's involved. So usually organized crime networks, they tend to balance density of connections with efficiency of operation. Because at the same time that they need to be clandestine, so they have to have lower graph density, they have to have enough connections to keep business, to keep order being spread throughout the network or money being exchanged. Well, the other concept that is very important is the relation between compartmentalization and modularity. So I've told you that humans tend to group into modules, right? And the same goes through with humans, obviously, but with criminal networks. And that is very interesting for criminal networks. Why? Because if you think of a cluster of individuals highly connected, that means that inside this cluster, it should be easy to spread information, to give orders, to exchange money and goods. But at the same time, when there is a sparse connection between clusters, the density of the network will decrease, protecting them against law enforcement operations. So, this means that organized crime networks, they are always trying to balance efficiency and density network to try to protect themselves somehow from law enforcement operations. So I'm showing you guys from now on some real data. This is the Brazilian Federal Crimes Network. We have here almost 24,000 individuals in almost 36,000 relations. Each color here represents a different community. And here you can see that when you have large networks, you can't see who's more important, and you can't see just by just using the naked eye qualitative analysis who are the clusters, who are the modules or the communities, right? You have to use some sort of mathematical tool. And this real case of a criminal network, it is darker than typical social network, as we suppose it should be, because of that trade-off between efficiency and secrecy. It is a small world network. You probably have heard about the idea that everyone is connected by 6 degrees of separation. And this is the same idea here. What is actually happening is that, let's say, a pedophile from the north of Brazil is somehow connected to a drug lord in the south of Brazil, for instance. Even though they do not know each other, they are connected through a lot of different relations, which makes it easy to exchange and to spread information, goods, and whatever you can think of when you think of criminal networks. And again, it is highly modular, as we supposed it should be. Remember when I told you on the motivation slides that some collective human behavior are very easily modeled mathematically, that human behavior shows a lot of regularities. And here's what we are showing with real data. We are showing that the degree distribution for the Brazilian Federal Crimes Network, and here we're showing the mathematical fit using a heavy tail degree distribution. And the fit is pretty decent, right? So just confirming that, yes, most collective human behavior show regularities that can be mapped using mathematics. So what about communities? This is the same network that I've shown you before, but this time each node is composed of a lot of nodes. So it is a coarse-grained view of the network, right? And this, when you see the network this way, we can see that there are some frailties here and here that can be of good use for the police. And particularly in this case, don't get spooked by the math here, but the idea is that we can totally break down this criminal network by removing only 2% of individuals using the module-based attack that I told you about earlier. Before going to the efficiency of police work, let's try to understand conceptually who are those brokers, who are those guys that are connecting different communities. They are actually individuals with specific roles in a given criminal community, in a criminal network, right? So let's think of money washers, lawyers, accountants, black market related individuals, right? And what I'm showing you here is that if you remove those guys from the equation, the effect is much more relevant than removing bosses, or copy, as the Italian like to say, right? So this is a change of perspective that has proven to be effective, let's say in the French Connection problem in the 80s, in which law enforcement was able to tackle this big drug-related operation by using tacit knowledge that those guys, those broker-related kind of guys, are very important in maintaining this criminal structure operating as a whole. So that being said, how effective is police work in the network science point of view? Is at least the Brazilian Federal Police, are they getting close to the ideal mathematical solution for this problem, or are they not? So let's try to, not to answer directly that question, but to get some insight about it. And to do that, we're going to use some data from what was called the Operation Darknet, which was a Brazilian Federal Police law enforcement operation which tackled a major pedophile ring acting on the deep web, precisely on the Tor browser. So just a few concepts for you guys that are not aware of. The surface web is the collection of web pages that can be reached using some typical search engine like Google, Bing, Yahoo, whatever. And the deep web are the collection of web pages that cannot be accessed that way. So for instance, academic information, medical records, legal documents, etc. And we have an even deeper layer, which is called the dark web, which usually requires some kind of specific software to be accessed, and it's usually designed to give anonymity to the individuals using this kind of network. So it is sometimes used for illegal information, child pornography, drug trafficking, private communications. It's not only used for crime, but I mean, because of the anonymity, many criminals use it. So what we have done here was map mathematically the relation between individuals in the following way. if an individual would post a child abusive information in that online forum, and another user would view that content, we would create an edge between the viewer and the poster, a direct edge, because the direction here is important, and mathematically it changes everything, and it is weighted in the sense that the amount of views that one person had was taken into account. Okay, and so we had 10,000 users approximately in a lot of views, 842,000 views, right? Before I move forward, it's very important to stress this thing here, because if we're dealing with virtual networks, the removal of an individual is an actual result of law enforcement operation, because we are actually removing that individual from the virtual network, not from the real world. So here the idea is slightly different than when we're dealing with real life networks, right? Some features of this network: it has this virus-like topology in which we have a core of individuals that are highly connected among them, and some spokes or leaves that are connected to the core. And the core here is composed of only 7% of individuals, which are the producers. So even though there are more than 10,000 individuals involved in this child pornography ring, only 7% are the ones responsible for actually producing content and giving a criminal dynamic to the system, right? And here we have the high in degree are the ones that are actually producing the content, and the high out degree are the ones that are only consuming the content. Okay. So police interventions, how good were we? Actually, 93% of individuals that were actually arrested by the police belonged to the core of producers. So the police was actually pretty efficient in identifying those individuals that are actually responsible for producing child abusive content online. But at the same time, police interventions were as effective as random removals. But there is something that should be said here, is that this network is more similar to terrorist networks and to random networks than organized crime networks. And if you go back to one of my first slides, you will remember that the closer a given network is to a random network, the harder it is to tackle it, to dismantle it, right? And this is the case here. Even the best mathematical tool that we have can only break down the network 1.5 times more efficiently than what the police has actually done. However, I'm going to be in favor of the police here, because if we change slightly the approach and we think not of the network structure of the system, but of the amount of views that each user has, the scenario is a little bit different. Here we are removing individuals according to the fraction of nodes that they have, considering the whole amount of views of the system. So here we can see that as we remove a fraction of nodes, we remove a fraction of post views accordingly, right? And the red curve here is the actual police effect, the actual effect in the post views, the number of post views according to what the police has actually done. And the blue one is the most effective strategy of doing that using some simple stats analysis. And here we can see that police could dismantle the number of post views in the network as efficient as 60%, right? And while we had a maximum, a mathematical maximum of almost 90%. And here it is important to know, to understand that even though it is very hard to break down the network structure of the system, we can indirectly break down the system by disrupting the post views, the activity, but not the connections, right? And in that point of view, police was quite efficient in this case. So I'm running out of time, but these are some references that if you guys want to take notes and check the maths and the analysis a little bit deeper. This one hasn't appeared yet, so hopefully it will soon. And I mean, I like quotes. You probably have noted that already, right? But this is another one that I think it's very important in our case here. The society that separates its scholars from its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. So it is important for all of us to cooperate, to have the big picture of the problem. We have to take a step back and check all possible angles. And I think that by doing that, we can actually save lives, save children, and have a safer future. Thanks so much, and I'll have any questions you might have.
Thank you. So the red town, the green town, the blue town, those networks,
Yes.
are all those networks like temporal? Are they transitioning?
They are. So the networks were built on data that was collected in 2014, 2015, and then the interviews were conducted in 2017. So by doing those interviews, we got a kind of a longitudinal we got a kind of longitudinal view of the networks, because of course the Garda have been working in those areas for a long time, so they were able to tell us about their parents and their grandparents and how the network evolved over time. So it really did, the networks themselves were temporal, but you could see those changes over time, and that they were quite dynamic.
And were they transitioning towards, I think it was the Greentown was the one with the strong family connections, right?
Yes.
Were they transitioning towards that, or were they transitioning towards something more chaotic?
That's a really interesting question, because you could see that really in Bluetown more so, because there was 4 different networks. And you could see that in network 4, for instance, started out with antisocial behaviour, and then there was that external influence of organised crime that came in, and the whole drugs network, and it transitioned into something quite stronger. There wasn't a family element, but there was very strong organisation and fear, and very hard to disrupt because of that. So whereas in some of the other networks, they were more chaotic, and that organisation didn't come in, and they tended to dissipate more so.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
How were the 4 networks in Bluetown separated? Because they weren't actually separate.
They were separated through the interview data. So because it was a Dublin area, most of the guards, even though there was 21 Garda interviewed, a lot of them tended to focus on one specific area, because that's the area they knew. So it became very apparent very quickly that actually these are very different areas, and they knew about the different people in the different areas.
Well, no, I was just going to say, and the fact that I led up the Bluetown one, the research itself, and I suppose the guards would say to you pretty early on that that's that area, you know, they're very open about that, and they would cover a huge area, but they would say, okay, I'm going to focus on this area because that's my area of work, and that was their kind of catchment area, if that makes sense. So it's quite obvious from them that the narrative there meant that these are the 4 areas. It wasn't this, we wouldn't have known that by looking at the map. It's just the narrative.
Hi Bruno, this is one for you. Bruno, the value of the kind of maths approach to trying to make sense of networks where there are kind of hundreds and thousands of people involved makes absolute sense. As you know from kind of our discussions, the networks that we are looking at in Ireland are somewhat smaller, a good deal smaller. What do you think is the kind of main contribution that you could make to, smaller population and networks which are much smaller size? What contribution does maths make to that?
Well, if I go back here, okay, we can see that with 12 nodes, it is still hard to check who's more important, right? So let's say 100 nodes, 200 nodes, we'll still have some problem identifying who are the main targets here. There are some features that just appear in networks when you have very large numbers, and that happens a lot in physics. It's scale problem. So when you have a very large a system, some emergency happens and you have some different phenomena. But when you have fewer individuals, let's say hundreds individuals, you still can use mathematical tools. They will still give you some insights that maybe the human mind itself would only be able to tackle with much less individuals, right? But anyway, every kind of mathematical solution should be supervised by people that actually work on the field and by qualitative analysis. Because sometimes you have a mathematical solution that can make no sense at all, right? So you have to, and it happens a lot actually. But anyway, it is still very important to use mathematical tools, even though you don't have a very large set of individuals, because of our own minds or the limitations that we have as human beings, right? Other questions?
Sorry, I was going to ask you about your Operation Darknet. So the mathematics gives you some theoretical notion of which. No, I wasn't really clear. You talked about node removal and edge removal, and I kind of understand what node removal is in theory, but I'm not sure what edge removal is in this context. And even in the context of node removal, you've got a picture of the network in some sense, and you're kind of identifying, from what I took at the end, the node, essentially the largest degree nodes, the biggest viewership of certain of these sites. But how does that tell you how to remove? I mean, this is where the police work comes in separately, right? The mathematics won't tell you who these people are or how they're removed, right?
Oh yeah.
And maybe you could explain. I'm not sure what edge removal means, or is edge removal possible in this context?
So let's go here. So first of all, here the mathematics will give you some insight about who is more important in the network, right? But that doesn't tell you anything about how to build a case against those guys, right? No, you have to actually build a case. You have to know who they are in real life. Here we're just like, they are just avatars for real people, right? So behind all of this, there should be police work, traditional police work, identifying people, building legal cases, etc., etc. So these are different things that should cooperate, but they're very different. Let's say that, for instance, the most connected guy here, let's say he's an expert in computer science and he can hide his trail. We won't be able to arrest him, right? So these are two different problems, that they should communicate, but they're different. And so in the criminal network point of view here, when you remove a node, you're removing the user, not necessarily the real person behind it, right? And when you remove an edge, you're actually removing the post, the views between the two individuals, right? Because the edge is actually the views between what an individual posts and what the other individual is viewing, right? So basically what we were doing here was, if we arrest the individual and remove it from the network, it is very hard to break down the network. However, if we remove the views, we can dismantle the amount of views, but not the network structure itself, right? The network structure remains the same, but the amount of views will decrease highly because of that targeting attack. But that doesn't mean that in the future other individuals will start producing and getting the number of views that another individual was receiving at in the future. You know what I mean? So yeah, it is tricky to get that, but it's basically node removal and edge removal.
Yeah, Bruno, I have a similar type of question, because sometimes, like when you remove the red, say, individual, and the network fragmented, but that doesn't mean the consequence of it weren't actually possibly worsened, because sometimes a fragmented networking can create more problems at a community level. Yeah. Sometimes a stable network can produce less harms, and we've seen that. I think that's one thing we've seen in Ireland over time, particularly in the drugs area, where it has become younger, more violent over the last 20 years or so. So what role could mathematics play in analysing the intended and unintended consequences of such disruption in the future?
Yeah, great question. So let's think of a multiplex network, right? You have a layer of criminal relations and a layer of family relations, and you have a hop in between these two networks, these two layers, right? Sometimes you're interested in breaking down just the criminal network, but doing the less damage possible in the family layer or in the social layer, let's say. There is a very deep gap in the literature concerning this kind of behavior, right? But I assure you that it can be mapped using mathematics, because similar problems have been tackled in different scenarios. This multiplex effect of being interested in fragmenting one network, but at the same time keeping the other one as cohesive as possible, right? So this is similar mathematical tools have been used to tackle this problem in, let's say you have Facebook in one layer and Twitter in one layer, and they are connected, the two layers are connected, and let's say that you're interested in removing individuals from the Facebook layer, but keeping the ones in Twitter. So if you have, let's say, some kind of competition between the two companies, right? So there are mathematical models that could be applied to this kind of social problem that you asked. There is a very deep gap in mathematical or sociophysics literature in concerning that, and I would invite any PhD student there to try to answer that question with a little bit more scientific grounds and studying it. I know that it is possible. We can check what the effects are in the collective behavior when we do something that will affect one layer, but the other as well, you know.
And maybe one or two more questions? No? Oh, Susan, do you have a question? No. Okay, well, I might give just some closing. I like the lecturing from this group, and they're nice and low. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming. It was great to see such a diverse group of researchers and academics come together for this event. Just before I kind of go into the closing comments, I'd just like to thank a few people, Sean and Catherine and Carol from the School of Law. Thank you very much for making this happen. And Bruno and Peg from the School of the Department of, I was promoting us there, Department of Mathematics and Statistics, at least for another while. I got an awful lot out of the event today. One of the things that hit me a lot was communication is so important in this area. So from feeding on what Catherine and Sean and Barry said, that it's so important that none of us exist in isolation, that the guards are feeding in to contextualise the data, that mathematicians are feeding in to inform how data is collected. Bruno's comment about how things should be communicated in terms of pro rata statistics. That's a serious problem. And it actually feeds into an event I was at yesterday. I was at the SFI Summit yesterday, and I attended a workshop on how researchers and academics should kind of influence policymakers and politicians. And I think something like this is prime for that kind of thing. So Dennis Naughton said that politicians are very poor at making the connections between how research can solve problems. And as we are all funded by the Irish taxpayer, there's an onus on us to make those connections and to communicate those connections. Another thing that kind of hit me was the ecosystem. So, there's obviously ecosystems within your studies, but this ecosystem is incredibly valuable. From what Vincent said earlier about how taking down one Western Union affected hundreds of people's lives around Europe. And then that leads us into how these type of research collaborations can be scaled up to the European and the international level. But from a conversation we had with Sean at lunchtime, it can also be scaled down to develop personalised and effective tools for supporting these children. So knowing who in their network is a positive or a negative influence. And I think it's very important as researchers not to lose sight of the children in this, or the big question. And I think sometimes you can get carried away with the cool science, the cool maths, but I think it's very valuable to keep that final goal in mind. What was my last one? Oh, the challenges. We spoke about lots of challenges this morning. We came up with solutions. Don't worry, it's fine. We have everything sorted. But I think sometimes, especially in our side of the house, we can trivialise, we just need good data. But from what Vincent said, that is not a trivial matter. And it can often involve going to court and getting DHL vans of data on paper. And we think there should be these nice, clean, big data sets available for us to dig into. So I think it's very valuable that we make the most of the data we have so we can provide evidence to the powers that be to give us access to more data. So they were just some of the takeaways I took from it. I hope this is the start of something. I hope this isn't the end of something. I notice we're still sitting on our left and right aisles. Alan, you're bridging the divide there. Oh, and Michael, gee, you're doing fantastic work down there. But from one of the suggestions earlier, I hope to, maybe share some of the connections between the two groups, and that we can grow these collaborations. I don't think there's many universities in which a School of Law and a Department of Maths and Stats could work that effectively together, and I think it's a very positive thing, and we should definitely try and grow it. So thank you very much, and just a round of applause for all our speakers today.
Just before we finish up, I just wanted to thank Sinead, because this was all her idea and all the work that she put into organising it.
It's only my idea now that it's been a success.